Now, since it is 3 o'clock on the nose here in Switzerland, and I assume 9 a.m. in Montreal, and whatever time it is, wherever you are, I don't think I'm going to get an intro unless Jan says different. So I'm just going to get started. So, hey everyone, I'm Zach Grant. I'm a longtime participant in free software and open source. I spent most of my time in the PHP, Mozilla, and MySQL communities. And I built my career up around open source. I know that we're all over the place, this ConFoo. So I should say officially greetings from Switzerland. I'm in a small town just outside of Basel. Of course, Switzerland is famous as being home of the web. Here we have a picture of a reconstruction of the first web server with a fantastic notice on it saying, this machine is a server, do not power down. And Switzerland is also famous for not only chocolate and cheese and so on, but also being as one of the few direct democracies in the world. And one day I hope to vote in said direct democracy. By citizenship, I'm Canadian. So this is a bit, it's always nice to do ConFoo because it's a bit of a homecoming. And it's awesome to see the chat in real time. I'd like to say thanks to Jan for the invite and the ConFoo staff for setting things up. I'd like to say thank you to the sponsors for helping make this possible. And of course, I'd like to say most of all, thank you ConFoo attendees. It's always a privilege and a pleasure, even if I can't see any of you this year. Also, before we get into the body of the talk, I'd like to pause a moment and acknowledge the bad stuff that's happening in Ukraine. I know in the PHP community, we've got a good number of Russian and Ukrainian contributors and friends. I feel bad for both sides. I don't imagine any of the Russian soldiers actually want to be there, or anyone who wants to be in that situation. I have no idea what to do to help, and I will do my best to find out. I encourage you to do the same. So the promise of this talk was to talk about what has free software and open source done and to put into some context. And there are a couple of camps here on what has happened. There's one camp that's mostly open source, not necessarily free software, but open source has won. In fact, we all know that if there were a software Olympics, open source would take the gold, silver, bronze, fourth, fifth, etc. place in a lot of categories. And even in the categories where it's not dominant, for example, I was using Photoshop this morning to edit images for the presentation. Even in that case, there's still a ton of open source behind the scenes helping make that software better. And in a lot of ways, people say it's won so much that now open source software is just software. Then there's another camp that says free software, open source, and the open web, all three are dead. And there are various culprits that various people lay the blame on. Some people say it's apathy. Programmers like us, open source developers, free software developers not caring enough, not fighting hard enough. Some people blame greed and say that capitalism and corporate business models are what has squeezed the life out of these things. Others say that it's zealotry, people being unwilling to compromise and thus becoming irrelevant. Some people blame our failed leaders. And we certainly have seen some failures in leadership. There are a lot of things that fall into this category. In fact, people say that other things are dead. Democracy, spelling and grammar, and journalism are all things that come to mind quickly as being institutions, movements, best practices that have gone by the wayside. But are they actually dead? PHP 2 says Damien. Yes, PHP 2. Of course, they're not really dead. In an emotional sense, though, it may feel like that. Even if you think that open source has won, you may still feel that also something has died, that we are missing something. And I think what we're looking at is not really death. What we're looking at is change that makes us uncomfortable. I think it falls into a few big buckets. You have a change in utility. An example of this comes with classified ads. Classified ads was, few $billion business in North America, maybe a bit more when Craigslist came along and completely destroyed the business model. People got the same utility, but how they got it changed. And that's a kind of loss. I mean, there's still classified ads and specialized publications, but a lot less. Sometimes it's a change in control. And we can see, for example, when AWS came along and made it trivial to spin up instances of free and open source software, that felt a lot like death or loss because there was a change in control. And it may not have affected projects that were mostly volunteer run, but projects that had a corporate sponsor or a business model associated with them certainly got a kick in the pants from that. But I think the most difficult change for us to face as a community is a change in social meaning. I know for my part, the early days of free software and open source were tremendously important to me. It may not look like it from this picture, but I felt tremendously important here. I had belonging in my life that I had never felt before. Yes, I needed a haircut too, and a shower. This is, I think, in 2002. And in under a decade, I'd gone from not having any prospects. I dropped out of high school. I had dropped out of cooking school. I was working a kind of dead-end job. And I had stumbled onto PHP and HTML and the open web. And, less than a decade later, I had a great career and friends and a community, and most of all, social meaning. And a lot of the places that I went, people cared that I was coming. It was like this conference. They wanted to see me or hear me talk. And that was the biggest loss I found as open source communities and free software communities started to wane. And I think a lot of us feel that. It's easy to resent people who come in and not only profit on the work that you've done, but also take away some of your social meaning. This is totally natural. All of these changes happen all of the time around us. They've happened all throughout history, and they're driven by tremendous forces, organized forces, disorganized forces, individual activities. They come in all sorts of classes. Note in this picture, you can see here, there's a protest sign that says Canada is too cold. Indeed. So some of these forces are like this protest. They come up spontaneously. Some of these forces are much more organized. There are tremendous financial incentives in the software business that really don't align well with free software and open source. And they are also things that are just hacks. As programmers, we often pride ourselves on being hackers, on being able to take a technology, an idea, anything, and use it in a novel and unexpected way. And copyleft is a great example of this. Copyleft took a legal tool meant to ensure one thing, used it to ensure something that wasn't exactly different, but at least it wasn't how people were commonly using it. So this device, this legal device that provided statutory monopolies to copyright holders, and of course these monopolies were also then sold to corporations, was then instead used to provide a kind of freedom to people. But of course there was a hack on this as well. At MySQL, I can say we in this case, we chose a proprietary relicensing model and were the ones to popularize it. And then we made a few mistakes along that road, like the FOSS license exception that made our GPL license incompatible with all other GPL licenses. A hack on a hack that did something that I would imagine Richard Stallman never intended. And this shows up over and over again. Anytime that you set down some sort of law or rule, you build a wall in some way. You build a fulcrum for a lever. And you see this, for example, with how the DMCA was abused or how the GDPR is being abused. In each of those cases, there are organizations that have figured out a business model based around shaking people down around potential infringements of these things. Another good example, this one older, is from the United States, where prohibition against alcohol ended up helping make an attractive business model for organized crime. People still wanted alcohol, and because it was illegal, they were willing to pay more to get it. And they were willing to do so with less safety involved. Not really what a public health measure like prohibition was meant to achieve. And these perverse incentives have tremendous impact. We can look at things like the financial collapse from over a decade ago. Incentives at financial organizations that were meant to improve productivity ended up creating a situation where an entire financial ecosystem collapsed because a few managers, a lot of managers perhaps, were trying to line their pockets with poor practices. And the people who should have been responsible for ensuring that those poor practices didn't go further didn't have the right incentives, didn't have the right concerns to make sure that bad things didn't happen. Everyone had misaligned goals here, and they were just sort of acting in their own best interests and very much against the collective best interest. In the talk abstract, I promised we'd go back in history, but I thought I had an hour to talk. So I promised that we would look at Sumerian god kings and talk about muftis and other interesting bits from history. But with the time that we've got, I'm going to stick to an example that is a little closer to home for all of us and a bit shorter. Let's talk about the Protestant Reformation. If we want to talk about zealotry and free software, of course, it doesn't hold a candle to zealotry in real religion with real stakes. If we look at early reformers like Wycliffe in Britain, Zwingli here in Switzerland, Luther in Germany, Tyndale again in Britain, each of them at a high level had a goal to help people have a more direct personal relationship with the scriptures and with God. And some of the tools they wanted to use to achieve this were preaching in the vernacular, the local language of the people in plain speak, and also in having the Bible available in vernacular. And at the time, of course, what not everyone realizes was that things like Mass were provided in Latin. And while many people spoke Latin at the time, it still wasn't necessarily what the common person spoke. And Bibles were very rare things, and they were also in Latin. And given that most people weren't literate, it meant that there was a very large gap between an individual and their understanding of the Bible, with a cleric always being an intercessionary, always putting their own particular view on top of things. The tools that they used, literacy, were writing, and then later Luther used the printing press, as did others, to try and make it so that Bibles in the vernacular were widely available. They had one specific set of goals in mind. They wanted to provide religious freedom. They wanted to provide spiritual freedom. They suffered tremendously for it. And we know how much bloodshed was spilled during this time. Many wars were fought. And none of this is what I think any of these reformers intended. They didn't have a bloody end in mind. But there were other side effects. Tyndale in particular. Tyndale is not so famous these days, but if you've ever seen a copy of the King James version of the Bible, know that probably 80% of what's in there is actually from Tyndale. Tyndale and other people working to translate the Bible into the vernacular shaped their respective languages. Tyndale shaped Shakespeare. Shakespeare shaped all of English. These are all side effects, though. These are all externalities, unexpected consequences. For these people, the change that they wanted to achieve didn't usually happen in their lifetime. Not just because the church would often cut that life short, and because life was also short at that time, but because the cycles of change didn't move as quickly as they do now. If someone participated in the early days of PHP, if in 1995 they started using the language and helping to extend it, they will by now this point have seen it go through a fairly broad arc of being very popular and then less popular, but still being very important nowadays. And that's not something that these reformers could have seen. They also wouldn't have seen all of the fascinating twists and turns and changes that have come along after them, or even during their lifetime. There are a couple of interesting examples. I think everyone's probably familiar with Henry VIII, famous for the murder of his wives, but also the first British monarch to support Protestantism. And why he did it is still a matter for debate. Was it merely a political tool to try and break the hold of the Catholic Church, the power of the Catholic Church in England? Was it to achieve a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon? We can't be certain of his motives in entirety, but we know that a reform, this simple thing, spiritual freedom, became something else entirely different. It became a very political and very personal tool for very powerful people. Another interesting story from this time comes from the King James that the Bible is named after. So the King James Bible is the first one that was really, really, really widely distributed in the English language. And what many folks don't know about King James was that he was gay. He loved very much the first Earl of Buckingham. And in his defense, he made a very interesting statement. And keep in mind that this was a monarch who actively sponsored a translation of the Bible to make it more available to people as a whole who read the Bible. And he said, I'll read the last interesting bit of the quote. Well, actually, I'll read the last couple of bits. You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak in my own behalf and not to have it thought to be a defect, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had John, and I have George. There's an interpretation of the book of John that Christ and John had a very intimate relationship. And you have a king speaking in his own defense of his relationship, which now, thankfully, nowadays doesn't need defense, but in those days it did, using a very important book at the time that the people he was speaking to would have likely have read or been expected to be familiar with to defend his position. Again, we have something, let's say the Bible is a kind of cultural tool, being used in a way that it had been used many, many times before, but certainly in a way that the original authors probably wouldn't have anticipated. Tools like the Bible, like the printing press, like the internet, like radio, like language itself, information tools are the conduit for culture. They are how the business of society happens. It is foolish of any of us to think that we can control them as individuals, as groups. Massive wars, huge undertakings are waged around control of information and information technology. I think it was in Orwell who wrote in 1984, he who controls the past controls the present. Meaning, if you control the narrative about what has happened in history, heck, if you control the narrative about what is happening now, you are able to achieve a great amount of social power. When it comes to free software and open source, this is an interesting thing for us. As a community, we often confuse our tools, software, for our ends, for our goals. We know that things like cylinder seals, the first real form of printing, and the Gutenberg press, they're all just tools. They are extensions in the end of the will of the people that control them. They're also whatever they become when they leave the control of those people. What do we actually have to do? If you grieve, if you're one of the people who grieves the loss of free software, open source, and the open web, maybe I challenge you to think a little differently about it. I think one reason we care so much about the free software and open source community is that within it, we find some sort of answer to the big questions, like the ones posed here by Greant. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? What do we want? What would we like to see in the world? Our values are often encoded in the guiding principles of both free software and open source. But we somehow think that they just apply to software. I sometimes have talked with people who resist things like, say, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. They say it's not fair that someone else is elevated above a perfectly qualified candidate. That candidate has worked hard. I think that's an overly simplified view. And I think it's probably not aligned with our values. I think what you're often feeling in those cases is a sense of loss because there's been a change of social meaning. When someone tells you that something isn't fair, that maybe you're not being fair, it challenges who you are, and it can be difficult to face. I know for myself, I've often had to go back to what I think of as first principles. I was certainly challenged, for example, in as I got to know the free software movement better and encountered Richard Stallman to find out that he wasn't quite the person I imagined. But I was still able to go back after some thinking and talking to other FSF volunteers to first principles and figure out what mattered. In the free software definition, we can often even pull away some of the free software pieces. It's about the freedom to communicate. It's about the freedom to help others. It's a freedom to improve your community. That's the freedom we want to preserve. In the open source definition, it's a more technical writing of this, but there's a great summary of the values that are held by many open source communities, I think including PHP. It's called the Open Source Way. And there's a great handbook around managing open source communities that is extended or built off of these principles. Transparency, collaboration, inclusivity, community. Releasing early and often, maybe that's not necessarily a social value. Even meritocracy, though, there's an interesting note here. When you read the handbook, it notes that meritocracy is challenging because it got some funny ideas with it. But we can say inclusivity certainly matters. If you're thinking free software and open source are dead, just remember our goals aren't dead. The goals behind the open web aren't dead. Choose the goals you want to focus on. And then pick the ways to try and achieve those. Whether it's conversations with your friends, whether it is writing code that you hope will change the world for the better, whether it is putting the financial resources you have to bear on the problems that we all face. Maybe it's using democracy or improving democracy to make it so that we again can deliver on the goals that we have, the values that we share. And the only thing I have to say is mind the means. It's always important to understand that there may be externalities, that the situation may be more complex than you imagine. Anytime that you look at, you find that there are unforeseen consequences, try not to dismiss them as collateral damage. Try to understand them and avoid them. So in the end, I think what free software and open source have achieved is that we now have a few generations of people focused on values that are about improving the world and equipped with modern information technology tools to help change them. What I encourage each of you to undertake as individuals is a way to give back to everything that's been given to us as free software and open source community participants is choose freedom as a goal and choose openness as a goal. Thank you. And I have 5 minutes left, which is fantastic. Questions, comments, rebuttals? I'm just going to stare off camera at the chat channel. Maybe I'll move it in line of my camera so I can just see the chat and actually look like I'm looking at people. So I don't see any questions coming in or comments. I don't see Yan jumping on the channel yet. Yeah. What's the open source project you're most excited about in 2022? That's a good question. Selfishly or altruistically? I think altruistically, honestly, I've been exploring some of the decentralized finance projects. And there are some really interesting things happening there. I know that the Web3 isn't without challenges and that things are very nascent. But there are some things that are really interesting. So there's a project called Centrifuge, a company called Centrifuge, that's working to make it so that small businesses can get liquidity for their assets at much cheaper rates. And that meaning practically, if you own something, you can get credit on it without paying so much. Big companies get credit on their assets at a fairly low rate, a couple of percentage points. So borrow 100,000, pay whatever back. But small businesses get a much less good deal. And this aims to change that in a way that's really smart. And since it's using Polkadot and Substrate, it's proof of stake rather than proof of work. So it's not just burning electricity to factor primes. And privately, I'm most excited about Grok. Grok is JSON-ish query language for JSON. And it's just fun and cool and a little bit easier to grok than JQ. Thanks for the question, Chris. I will be around for a while longer if anyone wants to chat. I'm 6 hours ahead of you, so and I've got a round table with Dems and Yan in 90 minutes. Well, an hour, I guess. So I will be around for that too. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy ConFoo.